minister at large at First Presbyterian, where she has excuse me, can you get my glasses out? I took off my sunglasses and forgot to put on my glasses, and then it would help. They're in the side zipper, the bottom zipper. I'm sorry. While I'm waiting, please forgive me if I say Mary Ann Stauffer Collins, if I say Mary Kay Stauffer Collins, or if I say Mary Ann Collins Stauffer. Because sometimes, when I'm not thinking, it gets all mixed together. Oh, now I can read. Anyway, Mary Ann is a dedicated minister at large at First Presbyterian and has been since 2015. Her work and her service has been varied and constant, some of which I will mention a little later. Here are some things about Mary Ann you might not know. She is a dual citizen of the United States and Switzerland. She was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Her father was from Bern, Switzerland, and her mother from Findlay, Ohio. When she was 8 years old, they started moving because her father was in international business. So they moved to Germany and then back to Ohio and finally to Switzerland, where she lived until her high school senior year. From there, she returned to Madison, Wisconsin, and lived with her aunt and uncle as an exchange student. She remained in America and went to college at Duke University. Go Blue Devils. And from there, she met John Collins. And in 1977, she and John were married, and they now have 3 grown daughters, living in New York City, Dallas, and San Francisco. Mary Ann has always wanted to work in her field, and valuing her marriage and family above all else, she chose to follow John in his career as a Navy doctor wherever that took them. It is amazing that she was able to continue her education and her professional work, all the while moving around the United States with John and the children. Her education is in clinical mental health counseling, nursing, and Navy chaplaincy training. It was spread over many years in many places in several academic, theological, and military installations. She earned a Bachelor of Science in Nursing at Duke. In 1980, she earned a Master of Divinity at Princeton Theological Seminary. And currently, she is a full-time student working on a Master of Science in Clinical Mental Health Counseling at Loyola University of Maryland in Baltimore. In the late 70s and 80s, Mary Ann continued her professional education, and it was vast. She held a presbytery internship in Madison, Wisconsin at the John Knox Presbytery. She was a minister in training at Bristol Presbyterian Church in Pennsylvania. Mary Ann studied clinical pastoral education at Trenton State Psychiatric Hospital and at Washington Hospital Center in D.C. In Newport, Rhode Island, she attended the Navy Chaplain School in the Officer Indoctrination course. In Zurich, Switzerland, she was in a full-time analyst training program at the C.G. Jung Institute. Her work experience includes being an interim minister of education and youth, Navy chaplain in the Washington, D.C. area, a parish associate in the Presbyterian Church USA in California, Salt Lake City, Honolulu, and the National Presbyterian Church in D.C. She was a minister at large in the Presbytery of West Virginia and of course here in Richmond. While completing her studies at Loyola, she is serving as counseling intern at the Counseling Center at Fort Meade Army Base in Maryland. She is currently a teaching elder in the PCUSA and minister at large at the National Capital Presbyterian in Washington, where she was ordained, and has kept her membership there because she was in the Navy and moved around so much. She is fluent in German and Swiss, and she also speaks French, Italian, and Latin. Mary Ann's time as minister at large at First Presbyterian has been primarily assisting Mary Kay with pastoral care and helping with liturgy and visiting the sick and homebound. She has also worked with the diaconate, training others to administer homebound communion. Mary Ann officiated at our evening chapel services and facilitated, along with John, many small group classes. Among them, Disciple Fast Track, a Philippians class, a Lenten study, and the very popular C.S. Lewis book study of Mere Christianity. Today she will be speaking to us about what has happened in the last 40 years of psychotherapy and the perspective toward the changes in psychology and the integration of spirituality into counseling. My personal interactions with Mary Ann caused me to best describe her as a highly intelligent woman with a remarkably warm heart and a deep caring concern for others and an unbounded love of God and family. Surely the light of Christ shines within her. Put another way, Jesus said in Matthew 5, "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify God in heaven." Mary Ann radiates that light. Just look into her eyes and listen to her soft-spoken words of wisdom and love. You will find Christ within her. It is therefore my great pleasure and honor to present our sister in Christ, Mary Ann Collins-Stauffer.
Thank you so much, Susan. I'm so glad that another military person could introduce me. I wanted to thank Blair and Melissa and all the committee for inviting me to come today. It's really overwhelming to stand here and look out and see all you people who I love. It's just, thank you so much for coming. I remember 4 years ago when I came to the first PW luncheon, I sat over there and Blanche and Carolyn introduced me. And it was that day that I learned, and I came away just so amazed by the graciousness, the hospitality, the organization that was part of this group. And that day, the lecture was on the Shroud of Turin. So I come here with trepidation knowing what you expect. Yeah. You're probably wondering, after Susan's introduction, why it appears that I've begun yet another calling. I've been a nurse, a German teacher, Presbyterian minister in a couple of churches. I've been a hospital chaplain, a Navy chaplain. I've been a parish associate, a preacher in little West Virginia churches, minister at large, and now I'm studying to become a counselor. I hope you will see, though, that in the work that I'm doing at the Fort Meade Army Base in their Pastoral Counseling Center as an intern, it brings all of these things together. And I'm just so delighted that I can be there as part of my training. I'd like to start this presentation in the same way that we start every class at Loyola University. For 42 years, the Department of Pastoral Counseling at Loyola has been starting every class with a devotion, a moment of meditation, or a song. Depending on the professor or whichever classmate is leading the class, the devotion will vary. So in my class, I have some rabbis. I have a
from a need to be accepted, from the fear of being lonely. Deliver me, oh God. Deliver me, oh God. And I shall not want, no, I shall not want. When I taste your goodness, I shall not want. When I taste your goodness, I shall not want. From the fear of serving others, or from fear of death or trial, and from the fear of humility. Deliver me, oh God. Yes, deliver me, oh God. And I shall not want, no, I shall not want. When I taste your goodness, I shall not want. No, I shall not want. No, I shall not want. When I taste your goodness, I shall not want. When I taste your goodness, I shall not want. I shall not want. Shall not want.
How does a counselor who is meeting with a person with any of the things that are on the sheets that I handed out for you to look at, any of the stressful things in life, how does a counselor meet with the person and bring into the session what we just heard, the peace, the joy, and the goodness of God? That is the topic that we will explore today. I'd like to start, though, with a personal story about this integration, when I first experienced the integration of spirituality and psychology. It was a gray November morning in the 1970s when I knocked on the door of an Anglican church. This was a church that I had grown up attending in Switzerland. It is in the middle of Bern. It is surrounded by the embassies. And this is the church that many of the diplomats attend because they speak English. If you were an American, you sat on the right side of this Anglican church. If you were from the UK, you sat on the left side. And if you were from Africa or Asia or anywhere else, it didn't matter where you sat. But this is the church I grew up attending when I was 12. I taught Sunday school. I don't know how a 12-year-old can teach Sunday school, but somehow. It wasn't a big congregation. And Reverend Hogger was the vicar, was the minister there. I hadn't been back, though, in a long time. My parents had divorced, and I'd gone to college, but College was now over, and I had come back to Switzerland to stay with my dad and his new wife for a while, and try and figure out what I was going to do. And things were not going well. My father's wife, my stepmother, disliked me intensely. No matter how hard I tried to be as perfect as possible, it wasn't possible. I was always doing something wrong, and she wouldn't talk to me for days, or she would hide things from me, and to make it all worse, my dad was starting to chime in with her in the criticisms of me. So I was at a very low point, and I decided I needed someone to talk to. So I went to see if I could speak with Reverend Hawker, and without an appointment, he opened the door and invited me to come in, and I can't remember exactly what we talked about that hour, but I do remember the most important thing, which was he said, "Marianne, it's not your fault. You are not to blame with this situation." Years later, I would think about that, and I would wonder, how was it that he had such wisdom and knew how to integrate something psychological with something spiritual? Because I'd encountered many clergy who didn't know how to do that. When he was old, 30 years later, I met him again, and he told me then that he had had many episodes of depression in his life and struggled with that his whole life. And at that moment, I knew why he had been able to reach out to me and truly bring a moment of healing in my life. Where can we begin to try and understand of this very interesting but tumultuous relationship between spirituality and psychology? And I'd like to start today with a piece of history that comes from Virginia. If you go about an hour south of here, southeast of here, you come to Berkeley Plantation, or Berkeley 100 as it was known on December 4th, 1619, when 38 English settlers arrived on the ship the Margaret. They had been at sea for 2.5 months, and journals reveal in their notations from the voyage that it was a very difficult voyage. Most of the voyage, they were on their knees praying, they said. They arrived, and immediately they had a service there on what is now the plantation, which was mandated in their charter. And the service was a service of thanksgiving to God. "We ordain that the day of our ship's arrival at the place assigned for plantation in the land of Virginia shall be yearly and perpetually kept holy as a day of thanksgiving to Almighty God." I love that story because it reminds me of how early in the history of our nation, spirituality and psychology were intertwined. People in their daily lives, they integrated both, and they found comfort in their faith during times of great psychological distress. In fact, as I thought about it, our nation has experienced much trauma since its birth. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why we have responded with great spiritual strength in our nation. Of course, at that time, the understanding of spirituality and faith came from the Old and New Testaments, from the Bible, maybe especially from Paul. But by the 19th century, it wasn't the Bible but science that became the tool to understand and heal the mind. Foundational work of people like Charcot and Janet in Paris, neurologists who were working with hysterics using hypnosis, as was happening all across Europe at that time. The work of Freud, who wrote about treating psychopathology through a dialogue between the patient and psychoanalyst, just something brand new. The early psychologists like Galton in England and Binet in France and Wundt, Kraepelin and Hall in the United States. On the one hand, it was really important that science, the neurological and the psychological sciences, were present because they were fighting against what was then very superstitious beliefs that were popular among the people. And the sciences helped to dispel beliefs such as emotional or cognitive difficulties came from moral deficiencies, from insufficient willpower, from not enough discipline in childhood, or from evil spirits. People had been turning to anointing or exorcism or charismatic healers to find healing. But because of this chasm between the scientific and the religious, scientific psychology that was developing in the late 1800s ignored any role for spirituality well into the 20th century. There were a few exceptions, and one of them was Carl Jung. In 1933, as World War II was breaking out, he wrote a book, Modern Man in Search of a Soul. He had been a student of Freud's, as you know, but he had broken away from Freud over the question of whether people had a spiritual dimension in their life. Jung was a descendant of 5 generations of Swiss Reformed pastors and theologians, and he argued against Freud that religion was not a delusion, but it was rather a reflection of people's spiritual capacities and wishes and desires and needs. So he wrote this book, and I have put the quote on your handout, you can read it, but he said that I have treated many hundreds of patients, among those in the second half of life, that is to say over 35. There's not been one whose problem in the last resort was not that of finding a religious outlook on life. So this was radical in the 1930s to say this, and went against psychoanalysis that was taking foothold in every university in Europe and in America. There's some historians who suggest that Jung's work, his academic publishing as well as his clinical work, supported the spiritual dimension in people's life, helped to influence the rise of the pastoral counseling movement that began after World War II in our country. The emergence of pastoral counseling as a specialty for ministers was first described in 1949 by Seward Hiltner in his book, Pastoral Counseling. Dr. Hiltner was a Presbyterian minister, and when I was a student at Princeton, he was still there. He was very intimidating. But he really, along with others, he began and influenced this movement that we know now of today, the pastoral counseling movement, that led to the accreditation of pastoral counselors, that led to CPE, clinical pastoral education for ministers. It was a big deal. And this was the first attempt to integrate psychology and spirituality, and it was started by the clergy. If you think about the word, though, pastoral counseling, in those days it was appropriate. The word pastoral is what our word pastor comes from, or priest, and it comes from the Latin, which means to feed or graze, so the idea of the shepherd, it was all in that word. But that was appropriate because in the 60s and on into the 90s, the pastoral counseling movement was leading the way in this integration of psychology and spirituality. It was really amazing, the books that started to appear, written by other clergy mostly, that were describing this blending, as Kleinbell says, of every art and science of life, including psychology, in this new form of ministry. I have a few more quotes that I put on your handouts for you can see. Also, in 1972, Henry Nouwen, whom we all know and have loved, wrote his book, The Wounded Healer. Henry Nouwen was also part of this movement, this attempt to integrate spirituality and psychology. He had been a priest in Holland, had come over, and he had gone to the Menninger Institute in Kansas and received training there. He was maybe the first priest to ever get this kind of psychological training in addition to being a priest. So he was part of this movement that was going on. But what happened? Something happened, because there's been a shift. Today in 2019, the pastoral counseling movement, while we still have pastoral counseling centers, is no longer leading the way in this integration. And I'd like to look a little bit more at what happened in the 70s and 80s and 90s that explain why this dream that so many people had of the churches leading the way in this integration didn't happen. I can actually speak to this time because in the 1980s, when I was a Navy chaplain, I had an experience of trying to integrate psychology and spirituality. I had arrived in the 1980s in Washington, D.C. to carry out my first Navy orders. I had been through seminary and I had been a minister for a couple years, and then I went to chaplain boot camp, like Susan said. And when I was at the boot camp, and I was one of only 3 women in those days, and there were 100 clergy, and I never had known how many Baptists there were. I mean, I didn't know there were 30 different brands of Baptists, so it was quite an experience. But at chaplain school, we were given this dream sheet, it's called dream sheet, to fill out, and we were told that we could list our top preferences of where we wanted to be assigned. Well, naive as I was, Susan will know better, naive as I was, I thought, oh, that's great. So I put down 2 things. Please do not send me to a hospital. Even though I have a lot of hospital training, I would really prefer to be stationed at a base with a chapel. Well, where do you think they sent me? Of course, they sent me to the Naval Hospital Bethesda, the needs of the Navy. And when I arrived there to report for duty, I was told that since I was the only chaplain out of 13 who had any kind of hospital experience, I would become the director of training for all the chaplains. No matter that I was the youngest one, I was the first woman to ever be assigned there, I was assigned to be the director of training. And furthermore, I was assigned to the 2 wards that nobody else had wanted, which were psychiatry and neurosurgery. So it was quite a daunting beginning for me in the Navy. Neurosurgery was daunting, but not as daunting as working on the closed psychiatric ward. And the reason was, this was the 1980s, the head of the ward was a Freudian, Dr. S. I'll just call him Dr. S. And he didn't like chaplains at all. He really was a Freudian. He thought that all religious thought was delusional. The previous chaplain hadn't been on the ward much. The Catholic priest would just go in quick, serve, Eucharist and run out. So I had to do something. I was determined I was going to do better. So I started showing up on morning rounds. On the medical rounds, Dr. S never said anything. And then I started to meet all the patients. Some of them could be there for months, and others would be discharged back to home because they had a diagnosis that the military didn't want. And I began talking to the patients and finding out that they were discriminating against if they read the Bible. They told me that when they went to their meetings, the doctors and residents didn't believe that they had real faith. They said that what they were talking about, that God talked to them or that they talked to God, was a delusion. I began to see that there was a particular cluster of patients who were cryptologists. The cryptologists were there for depression and anxiety, and it wasn't surprising that they had depression or anxiety because they worked in these small spaces. If you were a cryptologist aboard an aircraft carrier, you worked in a little closet. Nobody except the commanding officer knew that you were even on board the ship. If you worked as a cryptologist on a base, you worked in a little vault-like space. I remember one officer telling me the only thing in the room where he worked beside his desk was a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. So they were working in very difficult circumstances, and they were saying, my faith is what helps me to get through. So as the months passed and I met more and more patients like this, I decided to work with one of the residents to give a grand rounds. At first Dr. S didn't approve, but finally he did approve. And our topic, first time a chaplain had given a grand rounds, was how do you distinguish between genuine, authentic faith and religious thoughts or ideas that might be delusional? And that was the topic of our grand rounds. Slowly we did begin to see changes. Dr. S allowed me to put a spiritual intake form in everybody's chart and talk to everybody about their faith. And he also started to be much more respectful of people's beliefs. But in those days, this integration of spirituality and psychology was a dangerous one. There are all kinds of people who remember in those days, like this Dr. Griffith, who writes in 1986, when I wrote my first article about working in psychotherapy with religious experience, I was afraid that it would meet with such hostile response that it might end my academic career. It was dangerous in those days to talk about spirituality and religion in mental health. But there was a bright light for those of us who were people of sincere faith in those days, and that bright light came from Duke. The chairman of Duke, Dr. Bill Wilson, had since the 60s been speaking on campus and writing about this integration. He was a very strong Christian, and all of us who were Christians at Duke knew him. There were many students who wanted to go and become a doctor, become a psychiatrist, because of his mentoring and because of the urgency we all felt in those days to have this integration between faith and psychology. Some of Dr. Wilson's residents went on, one in particular, a friend of mine, Dr. Dave Larson, he went to NIH, and he had groundbreaking research. He started writing articles about how the use of prayer with people who were depressed was showing incredible empirical outcomes. But Dave couldn't get his articles published until the 1990s. But something had taken root there at Duke, and in 1998, because of Dr. Wilson's work, I believe, a center was opened, and I have a short little clip to show you. It's called the Duke Center for Spirituality, Theology, and Healthcare. And Dr. Koenig is now, has been there for maybe 30 years. Dr. Koenig is proficient in this area of integration of spirituality and psychology. And he's in this brief little clip that I want to show you.
What is it that makes religious practice good medicine?
Suffering is automatically connected with meaning.
A search for the sacred, a way of transcending everyday experience.
Religious involvement affects every aspect of a person's health. Hello, my name is Dr. Harold Koenig. Welcome to the Center for Spirituality, Theology, and Health. We at the Center are a group of researchers from multiple disciplines: theology, medicine, psychiatry, sociology, psychology, and nursing. We are asking the question, is religion good for your health?
As a practicing psychiatrist, I really am convinced that you cannot treat a person who is suffering from an emotional problem and not consider their faith background, their beliefs, their values, their sense of their connection to the universe, connection to God.
As a sociologist, I began as a skeptic. And the facts are, although we cannot totally explain them, in and of themselves, religious and spiritual practices have an independent and positive effect on health.
Research groups around the world suggest that people who are more engaged in religious beliefs and practices experience less depression, lower levels of anxiety. They're more likely to live a healthier life.
We know that religious traditions matter for health. We know that religious practices matter. Physicians and researchers, sociologists, priests, imams, rabbis, spiritual directors, and others can meet in a collaboration and come out with the ability to speak and to think in ways that were not possible otherwise.
Over time, we have studied the relationship between religious beliefs and practices and depression, religion and anxiety, blood pressure, immune function, and a person's genetic makeup, and coping with illness, their sense of happiness and their fulfillment in life. Religion affects just about everything.
The most striking findings have to do with the relationship between religious service attendance and mortality. They live 8 years longer on average. That's pretty impressive.
We've got a medical crisis in our country, and what we're realizing is that trained professionals within the medical field cannot do it alone. We've got to partner with other groups.
The implications are vast. These findings from research could transform healthcare. If you're interested in learning more about the Center and its activities, please visit our website.
So in the 1990s, there were some exciting changes that were happening to this relationship between psychology and spirituality. And I'm very pleased that a lot of them took place at Duke. Additional things that I would like to mention is how in the 1990s, the ethical and practice codes changed of the American Psychological Association, the American Counseling Association. The Surgeon General included pastoral counseling in the year 2000 as one of the mental health therapy forms. The American Psychiatric Association and the American Association of Medical Colleges also in the 1990s for the first time began to include the idea that a patient's religious or spiritual beliefs were important to consider when making treatment plans. Maybe today it doesn't sound so groundbreaking, but it truly was an amazing thing. It was revolutionary that these things were taking place. Many books started to be written and research started to be done about this relationship. And I think that it's hard maybe to go back and understand the chasm that was bridged in the 1990s between these two disciplines. I've included some definitions on the form for you to look at. I'd just like to say that spirituality, which is the definition we work with today in my counseling program, if you imagine spirituality as a big, huge, round, something, circle, religion fits inside of spirituality. It's one expression of spirituality. But with the changes in the diverse religions now in our country, this whole field of spiritually integrated counseling has risen. The pastoral counseling movement, of course, continues, but in light of the diversity in our country of religious and spiritual beliefs, and also because of changes in accreditation that have happened. So for instance, you have to be licensed to practice as a counselor, mental health therapist, social worker, psychologist. You have to pass state boards. Previously, pastoral counseling did not have anything like that. Now, a pastoral counselor can take the exam and function as a counselor, but previously this wasn't true. So there have been changes in accreditation. 50 to 80% of clergy today say that they're not adequately trained to provide mental health care. And the fields of neuroscience that have risen, the empirical research that's being done, the new interventions in counseling, this has become now a separate field. It's no longer possible to train, say, at a seminary, as pastoral counselors did, to have the adequate background in counseling. This is true in my program. When I started the program 5 years ago, the degree was to get a Master of Science in Pastoral Counseling, but that changed. It is now a Master of Science in Clinical Mental Health Counseling. And the change in the degree reflects the changes in our society that have to do with counseling. I'd just like to say, because I know I'm running out of time, one of the ways that we learn about how to integrate spirituality into counseling is through our assessment of the clients who come, and also through interventions that we work with them with. One of my professors said it's important to have a spiritual radar to detect the spiritual in another person, to ask questions about spirituality, for instance. Do you consider yourself a religious or spiritual person? There are wonderful intakes now that include the spiritual in the intake. This never used to be the case. Just like thinking back to the 1980s when I designed my spiritual intake, there are now all these intakes that counselors can use when working with people that include questions to do with the spiritual dimension. It's very important, I've learned, when you're working with someone to not assume anything and to ask them about their spiritual background and to ask them, how do you address the Holy One? How do you address the sacred in your life? Because people have now, very different ways of speaking about what is holy in their life. There's also an understanding that spirituality can also be more than religion. For instance, there's a story of the Dr. Pergament who coined the word spiritually integrated counseling in the first article he wrote in 2003. He was working with a client, Joe, and Joe had depression, serious depression, and Dr. Pergament just couldn't get anything to move. And finally one day he asked, Joe, have you ever really been alive in your life? And Joe then perked up apparently and said, yes, when I used to fly fighter jets. And Dr. Pergament said he just about fell off his seat because Joe didn't look at all like a fighter jet pilot. But they were able to begin to work with, he was able to work with Joe at that point using this idea of being a pilot and the spirituality that was connected with that for Joe. And eventually he did find great healing from his depression, and he went back to flying jets, not fighter jets, but flying jets. So spirituality is very broad. I guess that's what I want to leave you with. It's a very broad understanding today that includes religion, but it includes so much more. And there's so many ways to include it. But it's so important, and that's how, I guess that's why I want to get this training, because I feel that even though I'm trained as a theologian, I'm not trained to know how to really be sensitive to spiritual things in other people. I wanted to say that there are some great books nowadays, any of you who are working in the field of counseling and therapy, that show how to integrate this spirituality with cognitive behavioral therapy. Basically, you can integrate it with any kind of modality, whether it's psychoanalysis or narrative therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, emotionally focused therapy, solution-focused therapy. It all works, that you can integrate it. I think as I've been preparing this presentation, the thing I kept coming back to when it comes to spiritual integrated counseling is the importance of the counselor. It's important that I believe that the counselor have integrated spirituality into their life. That will definitely help you then to have that spiritual radar to assess that and see that in another person and be sensitive to it. I hope that you have sensed my excitement, and I hope you will feel the excitement as well to be living in a time when spirituality and religion are finally and actually being integrated into counseling. I still can't believe the mainstream research that is happening and actually being published today. Dr. Koenig, who you saw here on the video, has published over 400 academic articles, and I think he's written 20 books. And it's about this integration, not just into counseling and psychology, but also into medicine and nursing and pharmacology and just any kind of healthcare. I mean, it is truly something that I think is sweeping our country, and not just in our country. I read an article that was published in 2018 in the British Journal of Psychiatry, and well, I can't find it right now, but it was something about including religions and spirituality in psychiatric care. So it's happening not just in America, it's also happening in other countries. There are lots of articles in Germany and Switzerland, other European countries, and in Asian countries as well. I hope that you will leave here with a new understanding and appreciation for some of the historic changes that have caused really a revolution in this relationship, psychology and spirituality, and continue to be aware and look for the amount of research that's being undertaken and published. Even here at BCU, Dr. Everett Worthington was one of the key authors of a meta-analysis. He and his team, they looked at 46 different studies that compared spiritual interventions with people who had depression. And it was a high, like over 60% of all the studies showed that people who had depression but had these spiritual interventions actually did better. And also, if they did get somewhat depressed, they recovered more quickly if they had spiritual or religious faith. I hope that you know that you can find a counselor today who's trained to integrate religion and spirituality into mental health. And we didn't get to talk about it, but there's so many new ways of treating things that in the past couldn't be treated very well. Things like borderline personality disorders, trauma, that's something I'm particularly interested in. There are several different modalities that have been empirically researched and are very effective, especially for me working at an Army base. I'm able to see this. Things like depression, their behavioral activation, all kinds of new modalities to treat depression, addiction, burnout. In short, I'll close with a quote by Pergament. In short, times have changed. Mental health professionals can now talk about spirituality openly and unapologetically. There's no need to whisper. We do, however, need to become more spiritually literate and articulate as clinicians and as a helping profession. And I'd like to show you two books. Just to make my point again, as some of you know, I love books. And do you know that there's bibliotherapy? That's the therapy of bringing books into a counseling session and giving them. So I've tried a little bit of that, but I never get the books back. This is the book in 1949 by Seward Hiltner that really started the pastoral counseling movement, that really worked hard to try and be accepted by psychology. It never got the acceptance never happened as much as people had hoped. Instead, people started going in the direction of spiritually integrated counseling for some of the reasons that I mentioned. So this is what I was trained with when I was at Princeton. But nowadays, the training is something like this. So The Developing Mind by Daniel Siegel, which talks about all the neuroscience and it helps us understand mental health diagnoses, and this seminal book, Spiritually Integrated Counseling. So these are what someone training today is reading. And maybe that illustrates for you the changes that have happened in this integration between spirituality and psychology. Thank you.